uncle had a marina on Lake Erie, and I learned about repairing wooden boats. I went to work at SeaWorld of Ohio, which is as crazy as it sounds. I led the scenery shop there. And then I went and apprenticed in a commercial cabinet shop in Cleveland. So that's about the first 10 years of my career. And I became interested in arts and crafts furniture early on. While I was at SeaWorld, we hired a lot of college students part-time, and a lot of them were art majors. And one of them turned me on to Gustav Stickley and Craftsman Furniture. So it's really one of the most popular styles of furniture. It's also one of the least understood, and people aren't so well informed about it. And as I was learning to be a cabinet maker, one of the things I really enjoyed and I really got a lot from were books of measured drawings. And so I ran through all of the books of measured drawings, and I really loved arts and crafts or craftsman furniture. And I thought, well, why isn't there a book about that? And so it took about 20 years for me to realize that maybe I should be the one to write that book. And my first book, Shop Drawings for Craftsman Furniture, came out 19 years ago and is still in print and still doing well. So eventually, in 2004, after my book came out, it led to some other books. That led to a job at Popular Woodworking magazine. I was there about 10 years as executive editor, and I also did all the illustrations for the magazine. And then I left in 2014. Since then, I've just worked independently. I published my own things. I work part-time for the Society of American Period Furniture Makers. I edit their annual journal and their quarterly newsletter. So this is my website. And if you look down at the lower right, there's a link. I made a special page for your group where there are some deals, but we'll not be self-serving and commercial till the very end. I think, you know, it's one thing to see a nice piece of furniture and be really taken with it in a book or a magazine. It's another thing to see it in person. And then it's one level higher if you can see it in person in the context it was supposed to be in. And a lot of arts and crafts furniture, the homes they were in were one integrated design. And we'll see some examples of that. Here are some good places to go. Unfortunately, none of them are in your neighborhood, but the Roycroft Inn and the Stickley Museum are both in upstate New York. The Roycroft Inn is just east of Buffalo, and the Stickley Museum is just east of Syracuse. So they're about an hour and a half away. And so this picture here is the Stickley Museum. It's actually in Gustav Stickley's little brother's furniture building, his old factory. And this down at the lower right is Gustav Stickley's home in New Jersey. And it's been restored. The Grove Park Inn down in Asheville, North Carolina is another good place to go. And there's a museum that's about to open. It's been about to open for about a year down in St. Petersburg. And it's a a collection that one crazy rich guy put together. And so there are a couple of guys that would bid against each other to try and own the best pieces possible. One of the things about the arts and crafts period, it began in England and then came to the United States. And it's kind of a reaction to the industrialization, especially in England. In England, it was more of a social movement than here in the US. But, you know, basically in 1800, there really weren't furniture factories. Pieces were built by hand by a local cabinet maker. After 1850 to 1900, factories came into being, and most of the machinery that we recognize today came about in that period. With American furniture, especially the 1870s, 1880s, factory-produced furniture was kind of strange. It didn't really have a style. They acted as if they were building reproductions, but they were just kind of pulling details from here and there and doing a lot of things because they had a machine that would let them do that. So really the father of the American arts and crafts movement was Gustav Stickley. And he had been in the furniture business for 25 years or so. In the late 1890s, he got tired of what he was making, and he was doing what everybody else in that period, this kind of the age of golden oak. He was making that sort of thing. He stopped his business. He went to England and Europe for a couple of years and decided he was going to reinvent furniture from the ground up. And he was extremely successful. Within a year or two of his introduction, there were about at least 150 other companies knocking off his designs. So he also was involved with much more than furniture. So he published a magazine. It ran from 1901 to 1916, and it was called The Craftsman. Now, one of my bullet points here is the mission furniture myth. And people tend to think that arts and crafts and craftsmen and mission is all the same thing. The term mission furniture came about. One of the people knocking off Gustav Stickley also knocked off some chairs from a church in San Francisco that was designed by Bernard Maybeck. And he came up with this story that this is mission furniture like the missions in the Old Southwest. If you research furniture from the missions of the Old Southwest, it doesn't look like this. But that's a good marketing ploy that worked. The Craftsman magazine, the entire run of it is available online. And so there's a lot of good information, not just about Stickley and his company, but social issues of the time and other issues. Down in the lower right, this is the only photograph I know about of the woodworking end of his operation. Now, at his peak, he had about 300 people that worked in the factory just outside of Syracuse, New York. And it gives you a really kind of romantic view of this, it looks like these guys are building one piece of furniture at a time by hand. What you're really looking at is the very end of the assembly line, and these guys are fitting doors and drawers. You know, most of the work was done by machine. There really isn't much romance to it. It's factory production furniture, but it's very nice factory production furniture. Here's some pictures. I talked a little bit about seeing things in context. And so, you know, the furniture is kind of plain looking, but there are ways to add color and add design elements to the room. This black and white picture is a Harvey Ellis illustration from the Craftsman magazine. This is on the lower left. This is a house from the other crazy collector who isn't opening the museum, but he built this house to house his collection. And so, you know, you have a problem when you have to start putting buildings up to house your hobby. In the lower right here, this is one of the rooms in the Roycroft Inn. And the Roycroft Inn is a very cool place. It was built in the early 1900s, and it's been restored. You can stay there, and the guest rooms and the lobbies are all decorated with period furniture and that kind of thing. If you guys have questions as we go, feel free to fire them at me. It'll probably make things more interesting and more entertaining. Don't be afraid to interrupt.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
Old guy, new to this, always wanted to start out with a table saw and a miter. Now I've got $3,000 worth of stuff I don't even know how to use, but I'm interested. What did they have, lathes, and did they have all that stuff back then? When you say the machines operated, can you kind of go into that for the era?
Yeah, I mean, by the 1880s to 1900, almost every machine that we use today existed in one form or another.
Wow.
They didn't have CNC routers. They didn't have handheld routers, but they had table saws and mortising machines and dovetail machines, joiners and planers.
Okay. Wow. That's what I was wondering, how far we've come from way back then. We haven't come real far.
We're safer and more efficient, a little better than it was back then. But it's, you know, a table saw is a table saw, and a bandsaw is a bandsaw.
Oh, it's beautiful furniture.
They all existed at this time, and that's one of Stickley's arguments was, we have this machinery that's going to enable us to do it more efficiently. Let's build good furniture with it. And
yeah,
so,
I love that.
Yeah, here's some more examples. And one of the things about the period, if you look at this black and white illustration up here, a lot of the houses, the furniture was kind of built in, you know, built-in bookcases and these benches. There's only one freestanding piece in this room, and that's that little table. This is another shot of this house, a private collection in Wisconsin. And on the right is an illustration of a room from the Craftsman magazine early on. You know, so the idea is it's a whole environment that's reflecting well-made things and this style.
And what year was this that we're seeing?
The era we're talking about is 1900 to roughly 1916, 1918.
Wow.
When I was in school, we learned history by wars. So this is in between the Spanish-American War and World War One.
Okay.
And it was really an interesting time because big cities and suburbs were starting to develop. People had more leisure time. Their lifestyles were changing, becoming more urban. And so this was a kind of a new furniture for a new time. If you think about it, these were the first people that had electricity in their houses, that had telephones, probably the first people with indoor plumbing and kitchen appliances. This is one of the lobbies at the Roycroft Inn. And it's a good example of kind of the design concepts of the period. The room is paneled. Some of these things are built in, like this bench under the window, and it's really hard to draw the line between where the furniture begins and where the room ends.
Right.
And there's a lot of, color is all in the accents in the rugs and the upholstery and accessories like the lamps and in this mural up above.
I love the mural.
Here's a different view of this same room. And if you go to the Roycroft Inn, what's really nice about it is most of these furnishings are period antiques. And they don't mind if you touch them, sit on them, look underneath. It's really a dream place for a woodworker to go to.
Gotcha.
And a lot of this furniture is Stickley furniture. One of the issues Gustav Stickley had was among the people knocking off his work were his own brothers. And his brother Leopold had been the foreman in Gustav's factory, wanted to go out on his own. So Gustav loaned him the money to start his own furniture business. And then most of his products were knockoffs of his brother. Roycroft was a much smaller operation. And so this big table is a product of the Roycroft workshops. So where Gustav Stickley had 300 guys on the payroll, Roycroft had between 6 and 12 at any given time.
And his brother lent him the money and then he backstabbed him?
Yeah. Now this sideboard is from Gustav Stickley's own house, and it's pretty typical of his early work. One of my pet peeves about amateur woodworkers and people who write for woodworking magazines is they tend to throw in details that weren't really typical of the period, but we think they are now. And so this is kind of classic Gustav Stickley. It weighs a ton. It's all solid wood. It states its purpose really well. And then the hardware is all hand wrought hardware. On the left here,
It's all what hardware, sir?
hand wrought, either
They
wrought iron or hammered copper.
they made that too?
Yes,
Wow.
yeah.
Those were the times.
In Stickley's factory, he had leather workers, metal workers, rush seat weavers, uh, upholsterers, several different departments kind of doing everything they could do. This is one of the lobbies at the opposite end of the Roycroft Inn. And again, these are period pieces, really a great place to go and stay and poke around. The lighting is also really nice in there. And this is one of the problems I have with this period is I was taken by the furniture, and then the glass is also really nice. The pottery is really nice, and the designs and the linens are really intriguing. This is the interior of Gustav Stickley's home in New Jersey. In 1912, Stickley moved his offices and showrooms from Syracuse to New York City. And he kind of overextended himself with a big building in Manhattan. He leased a 12-story building, and he put a restaurant on the top floor. He bought this farmland in New Jersey. This building, which became his home, was originally intended to be a clubhouse. He had another home that was more conventional structure. This is all logs. His better home never got built. There was a recession that hit in 1912, just before the start of World War I, and it's also where income tax began to come into play. And so that really hit the furniture business hard. And Stickley ended up going bankrupt, being forced into bankruptcy in 1915. But this is in the lower left here. That's the house as it appeared in 1912 when it was brand new. And to the right here, this is the restored house. And one of the unfortunate things that happened is a lot of homes and interiors and even furniture got painted white at some point. So this entire interior had been painted white, and when they decided to turn it back to a museum, they had to strip all of that off. But this is, a pretty good representation of a typical interior. Here's some more scenes from Roycroft. As I mentioned, Roycroft also had a furniture operation, but it was fairly small time. And Roycroft won the contract to furnish the Grove Park Inn when it was built, but they didn't have the capability to make it. So most of the furniture in the Grove Park Inn it was made by other companies, although there are some Roycroft pieces here and there. The details are very similar, but these are more of what you would see kind of English details. Now here's this big table again, and this is a detail at the end of it. And so there really isn't, see if I can zoom in here. There isn't an easy way to do these feet. That you cut that out on a bandsaw and you smooth it back out. The same with this curved stretcher on the end. So instead of building a basic piece of furniture and covering it up with fancy trim and carvings, it's simpler, but the details are in the joinery, and the joinery is usually on the nicer pieces. You can see how it's held together. Down here in the lower left is a Roycroft book stand. And this was actually one of the few things that Roycroft mass produced. And this will knock down, and so they could ship it flat. And this is a collection of books written by Albert Hubbard, who was the founder of Roycroft. So these come apart and go back together. Often at an auction, you'll see them and the shelves are in upside down. The other thing that's distinctive about Roycroft is they put their name on anything, everything. Either the name spelled out or they had a logo that's pretty recognizable. So when Gustav Stickley started his furniture, kind of revamped his furniture company, these are the sort of things he made. And people who don't know the history very well tell you that this is all he made, big, heavy, chunky furniture. But he also did pieces like this that have more of an Art Nouveau influence. This little table on the left, that's my reproduction. That's called a poppy table. And that was, whoops. That was an article for Pop Wood. This is an original, a different table. So, you know, people tend to put him in this box, if you will, that it was all straight lines and linear stuff, but that's not the case at all. Here's some early pieces from the Craftsman magazine. Here's a Morris chair. Here's a big settle. And this bed and chest of drawers. Now the caption reads in green ash. And this is one of the things that happened, technological advance at the time. Modern stains and modern finishes were coming into being. So aniline dyes were a new thing. And up until this point, if you wanted to color a piece of wood, you did it chemically and you turned it red or you turned it brown. Well, with modern dyes, you could make it green. Stickley was taken with that idea and tried to sell it, and nobody wanted to buy it. So there are very few pieces. This is from an exhibit at the World's Fair in 1901. And so it's Stickley's line of furniture at that time. And here is a Morris chair. In 1903, Stickley hired an architect named Harvey Ellis to come work with him and design things. And so Harvey Ellis was known for curves, particularly these arched bottom rails and like the curves on the arm. But this chair was designed and built a couple of years before Harvey Ellis ever came along. One of the things about Gustav Stickley's Morris chairs is these rails on the side are always at a downward angle. And so that ups the degree of difficulty in making the thing considerably. Most of the Morris chairs you see people make today are actually reproductions of a Leopold Stickley chair that's far easier to build. Up here in the upper right, this is the mechanism for tilting the chair. So this pin, this wooden pin, goes into the leg, and that's what the back swivels on. And this piece back here, there's a row of holes in the side of the arm that let you adjust the chair. Now you have to decide before you sit down whether you're going to watch the ball game or take a nap. It's not like a modern lazy boy where you can just lean back in it. These are other Morris chairs. This is my reproduction on the left of this chair. And in my mind, this is the top of the heap when it comes to Morris chairs. It just really looks good, it sits good, and there are a couple of tricky parts to it that aren't terribly obvious. One of them is, like I just mentioned, the rails on this bottom rail. It's about half, maybe 3/4 of an inch higher at the front than it is at the back. And this upper rail, that line is parallel to the floor. And you really don't notice it at first. I hadn't really noticed it much until I went to build it. What this does is each of these 5 vertical slats now becomes a different length. And so they're angled on one end and square on the other end. So there's no forgiveness in getting those slats together. The other thing is, how do they bend that arm? And we'll see this again in a little bit, but the end of the arm is actually sliced off and then glued back on underneath. And it's really a clever trick to get that to work. Here's a view, if I get it to zoom, there we go. These pins are quite often missing. And having moved mine a few times, it's easy to see why. To move it, if you pull the pins out, you can take the back off, move it separately from the base of the chair. So where do you put those things? And it could be in your brother-in-law's pocket, and he goes off and they disappear. There's also a little donut-shaped spacer that should be in here that you hardly ever see in original pieces. So here's a variation of the chair, and people who make up stuff for magazines or write projects think these zillion little spindles is the absolute definition of the period. In reality, in the period, pieces with these spindles were only in production for a couple of years. And so I always get curious about these things as to why did they quit doing that? And if you've ever built something with that many little spindles, you'll realize it's because it's a pain in the neck to make those and to sand all of those. and particularly to get in there and stain and finish them. And then if you have to live with one of these pieces, somebody has to dust in between those, all of those little spindles. It's the other part of this that's one of my pet peeves is people go to all kinds of lengths to avoid putting in all those little mortises for the piece. But if you have a hollow chisel mortiser, it's really the quickest way to do it. You can use a mortise chisel that's the size, so you're only making one stroke to cut the entire mortise. It's easy as pie to set up a table saw to cut those tenons, and you end up with a better chair. People tend to route a slot in there and glue in little teeny tiny pieces of wood. It's an attempt to make it easy, but it's making it a lot more work. Here is the third variation of Gustav Stickley's Morris chair, with just a flat arm. Again, it's canted back, which to my eye, it makes the chair more inviting. These legs, these are about 3 inches square. And in Gustav Stickley's factory, he laminated pieces together and then veneered to cover up the glue joints. It's a thick veneer. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. When I first started studying these, I saw a lot of antiques that the veneer will crack if the solid wood underneath it moves at all. And my thinking was, well, that's not a good way to do it, because it's destined to fail. And then I realized that a lot of these pieces, a lot of original pieces you see, once they fell out of fashion, they were too good to throw away. So they ended up down in the basement or up in the attic or out in the barn. And under those conditions, these little cracks would appear. The other thing about this laminated construction is today people get all shook up about matching the grains to the end grain shows. But in the time, they didn't care. It was just whatever pieces of wood. So you'll see, obvious differences from piece to piece. Now, the real interesting part about this chair on the right is somewhere along the line, somebody patched that corner. And my guess is it didn't leave the factory that way, but somebody's dog chewed that end of the arm off. We did a nice job making that repair. Now this is an L&J.G. Stickley, Gustav's little brother, Morris chair. The big obvious difference is the way the back is supported. So in L&J.G. Stickley chairs, there are these little square pegs that stick up. And then on the underside of this stick, there's a mortise on each end that just slips over those. And again, the chair is adjustable, but you can't adjust it while you're sitting there. The other innovation Leopold Stickley had was the spring assembly. And up until this came about, If you wanted springs, it was 8-way hand-tied springs. Leopold developed these as a unit that you could just drop right in. So it's a factory solution to the upholstery. Depending on what year a piece was made and who made it, you'll see different ways of supporting the seat. This is actually like a thin rope that's in little holes drilled and put apart. This is a standard chair. One of the towns I used to live in, they had chairs like this in their public library. And this is the value of this is these things are so well made and so well put together, they're going to last forever. So I'm going to bounce back and forth here a little bit into what pieces are like and then how I make them, how I reproduce them. This is the L&JG Stickley quadrilinear leg. And so it's kind of a clever joint in that there's a rabbet offset each side. If you've ever tried to glue together a long miter joint like that, the big issue is it's sliding around as you're trying to clamp it, as you're trying to hold it together. So these rabbets eliminate that sliding. You can just wrap something around the whole leg and it holds together and life is good. In a factory setting, my best guess is they had 2 sets of matching shaper cutters made and milled these in big batches. It's difficult to do without that. You know, this corner here is where it gets difficult if you're trying to reproduce it with just a table saw. Here's a variation that I came up with. I don't know how visible that is. The pieces on the right and the left, they're just mitered and then come into a flat end. And then these other pieces, there's a little rabbet on each side of those. And that's not too bad to make with, you know, standard shop equipment we usually have. Here's an example of the laminated Gustav Stickley leg. And so you can see there's 3 pieces that are stacked up and then a piece about 1/8 of an inch thick covered into one end. And then when you're done, this gets beveled back just about to the glue line. And so that extra piece disappears when you're done with it. Now here's a different view of that. It's an easy thing to machine. So you have this stack of 3 boards glued together. You can run it over the joiner through the planer to get the edges nice and clean. Then you glue on the 2 veneers and then mill it down to size, running it through the planer again. It doesn't matter that this one is almost its full thickness and this one is about down to half. When you're done, you're seeing the quarter sawn grain on all 4 sides. And here's the same leg. This one, there's a crack in the end. That's going to disappear when I cut the tenon on it. So I usually do all of my mortises first, In something like this I prefer a hollow chisel mortiser, and I work from both sides, both from the front and from the back, and you go about halfway through each way. These tools are called floats, and you can see it's like a really thick saw. And so those are great for shaving down little bits and getting the inside of that mortise smooth. One of the things about through mortises is the only thing you really have to worry about is the show side of it. You know, how does it look from the outside? That's the only part that's going to show when you're done. And so from behind, this is hidden by the shoulder. And to get them to fit, often I'll kind of taper that mortise so it's a little bit wider at the back, because that's not easy to get in there and get all the way through. So after I've, go back to here, this, so that little pencil mark, I like to work from the actual pieces that I'm working on and not get hung up about numbers and measuring. So I hold one side of this, this rail up against the edge of the mortise. I make that pencil mark, then I set my marking gauge in between the other side and that first mark and mark at both sides. And that gets really close to this. I like to cut them just a hair oversized in case there's some variation in the thickness of the piece. And I usually cut the shoulders by hand with a back saw, and then cut the cheeks on the bandsaw. So to get that in, the ends need to be chamfered just so it doesn't bust anything on the way back out, and to get it started in the hole. You can kind of see fitting these is you get it in as far as you can, and then you shave a little bit off. You barely see. I take a pencil and scribble over those and then fit it in the mortise. The pencil lines will smear, and then with a float or a plane, I'll remove the pencil lines and try it again. And then the final, this piece, once it's fit, I mark a pencil line, and then the exposed part gets rounded over to just missing that line. And so it looks like it's flush with the outside of the leg, but there's a 64th to a 32nd where it's still flat sticking out there. These rasps are wonderful tools for doing the shaping and the rounding of those pieces. So this is all in my Morris chair. In the originals, the back slats would be steam bent, as would the arms if it were a curved arm. I generally slice thin pieces, somewhere 1/8 to 3/16, and then laminate them together to a curved form. This piece of plexiglass kind of evens out the pressure, and it works nice. You can see what's going on as it's bent. Once that curved piece is made, it can be run over the joiner very carefully. The other side can be sliced off on the table saw, again, very carefully. One of the issues with making a chair like this is these curved parts are longer than they need to be. And so how do you set the angle of the mortise and the location and the distance in between the two pieces? And I spent about half a day trying to figure that out. And I realized I could just make a stick. So this is just a piece that's the length between the finished uprights in the back when it's done. And I lay that down on the curved edge, and then I can mark the tenon that way. Here's most of the back being fit into the back post, and you can see these tenons are kind of wacky. I cut the shoulders by hand. It could be done by machine, but if you try to set up the table saw to do it, you've got 4 different setups to make, and it's real hard to keep them really precise like that. So I just mark them out, and the shoulder cuts aren't very deep. It's not a real demanding cut to make. And here's the arm. Again, it's just the top of the arm gets sliced off. This piece gets moved back to the bottom and glued back on. And if you notice down here, it gets slid in a little bit to get the thickness back that you lose from the saw curve. And again, I'm working with an arm that's too long to begin with, so I can trim that edge after I fit the through mortises through there. So the way I lay out that arm, again, I work from what I really have. So at this point, the base of the chair is completely together. It's all glued up. And I can lay the arm down on the tenons. And the tenons, they're cut too long, but I can now take my square and a pencil and transfer where that tenon is actually going to be onto the arm, mark it all the way around the arm, and it's a little tedious, but it's simple. At the back, it gets complicated because this one is going through at an angle. So Bill wants to know why a float and why not a chisel. It's hard to cut yourself with a float. It's also easier to shave off just a few thousandths with a float. And that's the kind of, that's the distance that will keep it from going together and looking real nice or being sloppy. So a chisel will work, absolutely, but I find the float gives a little more control for the very last little bit to take off. And that's when I do the machine work on these, I try to leave myself a little bit extra, not too much extra that's going to be a pain in the neck to get rid of, but just a little bit so where it won't go in, but then 6 or 8 strokes of a float on each side of each cheek will drop it in. And once you've done a few of these, you get a feel for how much oversized to leave it and how much to take it off, and it isn't isn't quite as tedious as it sounds. Now this is the back, and these are, I think, about 1.25 inches square. So I wasted it out with the Forstner bit and the drill press, and then pare it down with a chisel. If you can see underneath here, this angled piece, that's the offcut from trimming the top rail of the side assembly. And so I tend to never throw anything away because it comes in real handy like that. It's the perfect angle, both for drilling the holes, and then I've also got it because now I can kind of eyeball plumb as I'm cleaning that out. On the back side here, I think I mentioned this a little bit ago. On the back side, the mortise can be a little bit bigger, and it can actually taper from the front to the back so it's wider. It's still going to hold just fine. It's just easier to fit the thing. And the other thing that's tricky about these arms is the front and the back have to go down at the same time. You can't really fit one and put the other one off because it's in the way. And so to get the distance in between them right, this base needs to be assembled. Otherwise, it would scoot apart if you were doing them one at a time if it were loose. And you can see here, this pencil mark, that's going to be the finished length of the arm. I'm marking where that tenon pokes out of the top of the arm. And then once I've got it fit and I dress it up, you can see right in there, there's a little bit of a flat sticking out before the edge starts to round over. Most of the real antiques, the protruding tenon is rounded over by hand, and you'll see different pieces are done slightly different ways. And so I think that's, if you go back to the picture at the beginning of the 4 guys working at the end of the assembly line, each one of those guys is going to do it a little bit differently. It's going to look a little different. And so that's what you see. Now, I have seen all kinds of crazy setups to make that a perfect pyramid. And again, it's a detail that we're applying from our modern sensibilities that you really wouldn't see on an original piece. Now here's the pegs that support the back. If I've got a lathe available, I like to turn this section out of a longer block. Getting a good dowel that's going to be consistent in size is a real issue, and so I'm convinced you're better off just making them. If the arm gets a little thin, these holes can be a little bit smaller. These are 5/8. A lot of times when I'm teaching this in a class, somebody doesn't have a slightly thicker piece to make the arm. And so a 1/2 inch is still okay on these. Again, I just round these things with a block plane and a rasp, and call it a day. It looks like the original, and I can do that faster than I can find the right router bit and the wrenches and set up the router table and figure out a way to hold that little piece. Here's the donut that goes in between the back post and the leg. So the leg sticks over, or the arm sticks over the leg about an eighth of an inch. And then this donut's about a quarter of an inch. So that's got that comfortably inside the arm, so it swings up and out. Now, I will admit to a big mistake here. In the original pieces, this is the length of the post that goes in the arm. This one is supposed to be a lot shorter. For some reason, I made them all the same, and I've lived with it. So don't tell anybody. The other thing is pegging the tenons. And one of the things I come up against is things that are fashionable. And so a while ago, it became fashionable to draw bore mortise and tenon joints. And you guys familiar with what I'm talking about? That when you drill, when the joint's assembled and you drill through, the hole in the tenon is offset a little bit so that dowel going through pulls it tighter. That's a good technique for building a barn out of green lumber, green timber. Totally unnecessary for furniture, in my opinion. So I clamp the joints up and drill straight through. Now the pegs, again, you can't find a white oak dowel that's going to be exactly 3/8 of an inch in diameter. If they make them, they shrink on the way to the store and never fit. It's real easy to make these. And so I start with a little block of wood, and then I split off squares that are a little bigger than what I need. And I whittle the end so it's narrower, and then I drive it through this plate. And I hope you can. This is a scrap piece of 1/4-inch steel. Lee Nielsen makes a really nice one of these. It's about 80 bucks, I believe. And I admire the heck out of Tom Lee Nielsen, but that is way overkill and way out of my budget. Anybody who welds or does metal work is going to have a piece of this laying around, and most likely will give it to you. And then it's just going to the drill press and drilling a series of holes. These are about, each one's about a 32nd bigger than the last. And usually only have to drive through maybe 3 holes, sometimes 2. They don't come out perfect, and sometimes they bend a little bit, but because they've been split from that piece of wood, they aren't going to break. And if you had a dowel that came from a factory somewhere, there would likely be places where the grain runs out and they would break when you drive them in. And so I just place that over a dog hole on my bench and pound them on through, a little glue, get them in the hole, and then saw it off flush when it's done. So I want to take a little bit of a look at some case pieces here. This on the left is a music cabinet. That's my reproduction. Here's some pieces of the original. And if you look at the joint where everything comes together in the middle of the door, I did it this way. And this was a detail that the first couple of years of Stickley's production, you would see it. And then they stopped doing that after a few years. And I always wondered why. And so I tried it and I discovered why. It takes a while to do that. Here are some other cases, pretty typical. A lot of Stickley's work, this curve at the top appears. And it's just kind of like gently rounded from the front of it. You'll often see the same piece. You know, this, because it has glass on the sides, is a china cabinet, but they made the same piece with solid sides that would be a bookcase. And the through tenons are a signature mark, you know, as are the pegged mortise and tenon joints on the rails. And in some pieces, you would see the through tenon with the key in there. This is kind of a variation of the music cabinet. One of the few pieces where you see dovetails instead of mortise and tenon joints. These are some other cases. These are Harvey Ellis designs. This is a bookcase I made. This is a drop front desk that's based off the same design features. And what's cool about this, there's a little inverted pyramid up there that decorates this. So it's really well thought out. As this is made, that's a solid wood side. There's a bit of a face frame that's in there to hinge the door on. And then there's this thin strip that covers up the joint and this little architectural capital that goes on top. This is the normal lap joint. You know, so you have a T-shaped piece, and the one on the bottom gets the top part cut out, the one on the top gets the bottom part cut out, and it fits right together. And then the glass goes in from behind. Typically, you'd see little 1/4-inch square pieces of wood holding the glass in. This is another Harvey Ellis design, and this one isn't in the best of shape. It's coming apart a little bit at the top. However, the proportions of this are really intriguing and really work well. One of the things is the legs. They used to be referred to as a bowed leg, but it's not a curve. It's tapered from the bottom up to about there, and then it tapers the other way at the top. It really makes it a lot more interesting. The other thing is the drawers on this. Generally, you see the biggest drawer at the bottom. And here they've switched that around, which I think makes it a lot more interesting. Here's the drawer, and Gus Stickley drawers, you would have this center runner placed into the bottom of the drawer and held in with screws, it's just a little bit thicker than the drawer front. So that's sticking down maybe a 32nd of an inch. And so it's actually riding on these runners in here, and that keeps the drawer sides from wearing out the rail going across the front. And then there's a couple little dowels in here that hit the drawer front and stop the drawer from going in too far. The other thing about the drawers, let me back up here. On the side edges of the drawer, there's this little ear sticking out. And it took me a while to realize, to figure out why they would do that. You can see it a little better on this buffet case. That's cut out and put together, and that's sticking out maybe 1/8 of an inch. And if you think about a factory situation, you can have some kid dovetailing the drawer boxes together. You can leave the drawer fronts long, cut a rabbet on the back of the drawer front. So now the guy at the end of the line who's fitting these things, trying to get the gaps just so you only have that narrow piece to trim off. And that's just a few swipes with a plane instead of taking the whole side of the drawer down. And these are some other Harvey Ellis pieces that kind of companion pieces to that dresser. One of the cool things about this vanity is behind the pull, there's a disc of walnut that's surrounded by a disc of brass. And so it looks a lot nicer. Now, almost everything that you'll see in original pieces was quarter sawn white oak. In the Stickley catalogs, they also offered things in mahogany, and they also offered things in curly maple. This is the curly maple, and I took this at an auction, and so there are probably 100 pieces at the auction. There was this one in curly maple. And the mahogany you see about that often. Very small percentage of the actual production was in those other woods. The maple was always listed in the catalog as having an iron stained finish, where if you take rusty nails and soak them in vinegar, you get ferrous sulfate, and it will react with the tannin in the wood. In oak, it'll turn it purple. In walnut, it'll turn it black. In maple, it turns it kind of this odd bluish gray. I've never seen an antique maple piece with that color, and I've never seen a photograph of an antique maple piece with that color. The brown finish is what you always see. My guess is somewhere in the 20s or 30s or later, somebody got sick of the funny looking blue and refinished it and stained it brown. But these designs work so well, and they work in just about any cabinet wood. So I think that's a nice look. Let's run through how I make the cases. So you've got these through mortises in the case sides. My weapon of choice is a router with a bearing bit going through a template. For making the templates, I used to go through all these machinations of carefully cutting that out with a jigsaw. And then one day in a cabinet shop, I saw a guy who just used double-sided tape and stuck little pieces down. So you can see here, I've laid it out full size. I put these strips everywhere except where there's a mortise. Then I can just drill a hole and route that back out. So it's really a quick way to make that jig. And so here's another jig and the router and the results of that. Doing tenons, if I don't cut it by hand and then cut the cheeks on the bandsaw, I like this homemade tenon jig and the table saw. And it's pretty simple to make. The only critical part of it is getting this piece that rides across the top of a fence, the width of the fence, so it is sloppy when it slides along. It's real easy to set up. It's safe to use. My hands aren't anywhere near the blade. And because it's on the fence and the fence is adjustable, it's a piece of cake to dial it into exactly the thickness you need. When we route those mortises, you have a round end to deal with. And there are all kinds of methods to avoid using a chisel, but it's pretty easy to learn how to use a chisel. On the long edge, this area back in here is nice and flat. And so I can place the back of the chisel on that flat at an angle and then just angle it down in to cut into the corner. And then that leaves the just the end to be cut. And when you sharpen chisels, if you get the back this shiny, it looks real good in the photo. That's a little magazine trick. So now getting the tenons on the top and bottom of the case, a guy in a class one time said, "You really hate numbers, don't you?" And it's like, no, I don't, but it's a lot easier to lay this piece on top of the other piece and mark exactly where those mortises are than it is to measure one and measure the other and try to mark it. There's too many places where you can be off just a little bit doing that. Then it's taking a router and essentially cutting a real wide rabbet on each side of that piece. Then where the two tenons come down, I usually cut those by hand. That leaves all the area in between. And so I'll take a jigsaw, or if it's not too big, I'll go over to the bandsaw, cut out that waste in between, then set up a straight edge so I get a nice flat area at the back of that. And again, you can see there's a pencil mark there. That's where it should come through the other side. And I'm rounding that off, staying in that outside zone, just to be able to get it in the hole and get it fit. And again, you're doing two tenons at the same time, so you have to be careful that you don't get hung up on one and take too much off and then destroy the fit of the other. And so here's the peg going in. As I was building this, Glenn Huey asked me if I really thought that peg was necessary. And I said, well, yeah, if an asteroid crashes into the moon and changes the orbit of Earth and we get closer to the sun and the temperature heats up and melts the hide glue out, yeah, then you're going to need that peg. Usually these things are so sturdy, you know, just dry fit together. It's a real solid case. And I always think if a tornado comes along, here's where I've got to hide. So that's the easy part. Here's doing these lights in the door. I originally hoped that I could make a router jig that would just cut that out, and all I'd have to do was get the corner. It didn't work out that way. And so I ended up cutting these by hand to start with. To get that to come to a nice point right in the middle, like here's a line coming through, so I need to cut on that side, on this side of the mullion, and this side on this side of it. And otherwise you leave a hole in there, it doesn't look so good. So the router, I saw them first, then with this jig on the router, I come in and it's really using the router to create a flat spot down inside there. And then they get trimmed out. And then here's the other side where that comes in just a little bit. And you usually see this detail with like beaded doors. If there's a bead routed in around there, this will let you miter that molded piece together. This router jig makes most of this recess. Again, the router leaves a rounded edge in there, but I've got the jig to use as a guide for the back of the chisel. Here's another little float, just cleaning the junk up inside that mortise. Quick and easy. Then the other pieces, here I'm bandsawing to create the tenon. This just gets cut. This is actually a bench hook with a 45-degree angle cut in it that I use to miter off those little corners. And then they get trimmed with a shoulder plane. You have to be really careful doing these because if you take what you take off this side also affects how the other side fits. So it's a lot of making a swipe or two with the plane, checking the fit, making a swipe or two on the other side, checking the fit, and knowing when to swipe. The other end of that, these just come to a point and that butts in to the other piece. And people have asked me, why don't you put another mortise and tenon in there? And it's because at this point, I'm pretty tired of fussy joinery, and this should hold together, and it does. It's very strong once it's assembled. Some pieces, these inlays appeared for a brief period in 1903, and then they tried again around 1909. Harvey Ellis gets the credit for these designs, and I think they're just really lovely. The elements of these, this is pewter and copper and exotic woods. And the way these are made is there's a sheet with the inlay in this field of quarter sawn white oak. That entire thing gets glued onto the back, the upright in the chair back. Now in 1903, this was all done by hand. They introduced this line, they made samples, sent samples out to stores, and nobody would buy them. Most likely, it pushed the price past what people were willing to pay. Today, the current Stickley company, they use CNCs and lasers and spank these things out and put them almost everywhere. Some of their supposed reproduction pieces, they've got the inlays applied in places they don't belong. And here is this is an original book rack, and it's kind of nice. These two pieces on the top let you see the titles of the books as they sit in there. This is my reproduction and a couple of examples of these kinds of tenons. And it's just like all the other through tenons, except now we've got an extra mortise in here. I usually do those on a hollow chisel mortiser. I set a block of wood under the tenon and chop a square hole. The way these work, however, is that secondary mortise needs to be slightly behind this piece that it's coming through. And that way, when the wedge comes in, it pulls it tight and holds it together. There's a bit of a slope on the front edge here, and you can see there's two sets of marks. That back mark is the original square tenon, and then it's slanted down. That's about a 1/16 of an inch distance in there. And so I just take a chisel, make a little cut on the sides, and stick it the end of the chisel in the line, and that's a pretty easy cut to make. Then when these go through, you can figure out the angle from how you cut the mortise and make the piece long, and then you come up and down the same distance. The only thing to really watch out for is that you have enough material back here, because if you smack that peg too hard, it'll blow the end of that out. The good news is if you do that, if you can find the piece, you can glue it right back in. Here are some other pieces. Here's the completed book rack. I think I tend to get carried away and make this cutout too big. One of the oddities about these pieces is on the originals of these book racks, there's a peg right in there. And nobody really knows why it's there, what it's doing. There's a man named Bruce Johnson who collects and has a website called Arts and Crafts Collector, and he hosts a conference at the Grove Park Inn, and he got curious about it. His wife is a veterinarian, so he took one of these down to her x-ray machine and x-rayed it, And so this comes in about 3 inches and stops. And it really doesn't make sense for it to be there, but it's there on the originals. Here's some other pieces that I made. I leave the peg out of here because if it's going to break, it's going to break up in there where the short grain is. This is a clock I made, built by an English designer, CFA Boise. And it was kind of my mindset. If you look closely at this, there's another one in the background, and there's another one that's not quite together. When I did this, the original is over here. There are 2 or 3 of these that exist, although I think one is not so good fake. They also made this clock. This one is cast in aluminum, and they made them at the time in ebonized oak, completely ebonized oak. I wanted to jazz it up and change the legs. I couldn't decide if I wanted a black face with light legs or black legs and a light face. So I made parts to do them either way. We did this, we filmed a video of this while I was at Pop Wood. So I wanted to have 2 examples so I could do it like a cooking show where you put the thing in the oven and then you turn around and you pull a fully cooked one out of the oven. And then I made a prototype at the back. This is what you see at the back. Anyway, I was trying to decide what color scheme to make this, and I was showing it to my wife, and I showed her the original, and she said, "Ooh, I want that one." And I said, "That's fine, you're going to paint it." She said, "No problem." So I ended up with making parts for 6 or 7 of these. I've got 2 completed, 1 nearly completed, a painted one. We've got to figure out the dial. I probably will get this laser cut to engrave it. So that's right. And I got a box of parts down in my basement. This blanket chest is another piece I made at Pop Wood. If you remember back at the beginning, this same chest in the dark oak with the metal hardware all over it was what the originals were like. And I'm kind of a fan of good proportions and asking, well, what would this look like if it were in a different wood? And so this is quilted maple and Jatoba, I think, is the darker wood on that. This is a little oddball piece. Showed up at an auction and we decided to make it for Pop Wood. This is a little piece. It's very similar to Stickley's production pieces, but this was a do-it-yourself project in the Craftsman magazine. And this one little piece is a great lesson in building this kind of furniture. The legs are laminated with the veneer, and there's through mortises, and this is a half lap in the middle there. I figured out that if you got the 4 legs and the cross stretchers together, I could then build a jig around the tenons to route out the mortises in the top. And so there's a video of that somewhere online, but pretty cool method to do that. And I think, finishing. finishing and fuming. Original pieces were fumed. In the factory, they had these canvas-like tents that hoisted up into the ceiling and could then be dropped down. So if you take white oak and you expose it to strong ammonia fumes, it turns the wood a color. It makes it darker. Now, again, this was something that the first few years of a production, that's how they did it. Aniline dyes and modern finishes were being developed, and so Stickley switched over sometime around 1905, 1906. The problem with fuming is it's a chemical reaction between the ammonia and the tannic acid in the wood. You can make it a little bit darker if you coat the wood with something like tea that has a lot of tannic acid in it. However, different trees have different amounts of tannic acid, and if you get any sapwood, it doesn't take. A lot of people say, well, the way around that is make sure that every board comes from the same tree. There's a lumber yard not too far from us, Frank Miller Lumber, which is the source of 90–95% of the quarter sawn white oak in the country. And I was talking to one of the guys there that runs a retail operation, and he made me promise that I would never tell anybody to make sure that their wood always comes from the same tree. The way their mill runs is they're cutting 2 logs at a time. While one log is coming back around to the big bandsaw, the other one's going through, and it all gets mixed up together. There's no way to tell what tree the wood came from. So here's, you just need a simple frame. Some people do this with PVC pipe. Some people will go rent a U-Haul trailer and use that as their fuming chamber. I covered this frame, put the piece inside, covered it with plastic, sealed it down around the floor, and left a little flap right by the back door that I could open up. And I used blueprint ammonia, which is 28% anhydrous ammonia. What you get at the grocery store is about 5%. There's a janitorial strength you can find that's about 10%. Blueprint companies use the much stronger stuff, and it's really nasty, and you don't want it in your eyes, and you don't want it in your lungs. So if you try this, that's how you do it. So the chamber is all set up. Wearing gloves and goggles and a respirator, I poured a little ammonia into a ceramic bowl, set it inside, sealed it up, and left it for a day. One of the things about fuming is when it comes out, it looks like you've ruined it. It gets kind of darker, but it's kind of burnt and dull and just doesn't look so good. The magic happens when you coat it with shellac. And I generally use amber shellac or amber shellac and clear shellac, about 50-50. And that brings the color up and looks pretty good. Now, this is what happens if there's some sapwood that you don't notice, which is real easy to do with white wood. It doesn't, the fumes don't affect the color. And there's a description in Stickley's magazine where he talks about touching these things up with a little dye and a little shellac, and you carefully brush it on the light spots until you get the color to match. It's kind of tricky, kind of tedious. So fuming is interesting, but there's a reason Stickley abandoned it in favor of dyes. This next piece, this is my Morris chair, and here it is in the raw. This is Lockwood aniline dye, and they make fumed oak as one of their colors, and there's a light, a medium, and a dark. I like to mix the dye with alcohol because I can kind of see what's going on. It doesn't raise the grain, and I can kind of control it. If there's a light spot, I can come back and hit it again. The aniline dyes look almost as bad as if you fumed it. And again, this is after the dye has dried. This is with one coat of amber shellac. Same deal on the music cabinet. It's a little bit darker, but it looks pretty bad until the shellac goes on. And so that's kind of my go-to finish. There's a third likely finish if you use walnut Danish oil and a walnut oil stain. Put both of those on and then coat it with shellac. That's pretty easy and pretty foolproof. And the other rabbit hole that I've been down is Birdcliff furniture. Birdcliff was very small and only in operation for a couple of years, but this is the kind of furniture they made. And I just was really taken with it. On the left is my reproduction. I built that while I was at Pop Wood. On the right is the original that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And again, here's the green stain making an appearance. And so very few people did that, made that. And over time, you know, it's nearly faded off of this piece. So Birdcliff was an interesting art colony in Woodstock, New York. And here's some other pieces from there. One time on my blog, somebody suggested I teach a class in making the big linen press. And I said, well, that's crazy to try and do that in a week-long class. But there is this little drop front desk, and I started researching this desk, found out where it was, asked if I could come see it, and they were very nice. They let me come see it and measure it. I just really like, you know, one, the proportions, two, the use of these carvings in the panels. The panels, see how close we can get here. That's not very deep, but it really adds significantly to it. This wall cabinet is also from Birdcliff, and it's been done a couple times in magazines, but nobody has ever had the nerve to really carve it. They cut this out a 1/4 inch something or other and glue it on a panel. And I'm sorry, but that's cheating. If you're going to reproduce something that's carved, you ought to learn to carve. This caused me to fall into a carving rabbit hole. This is another birdcliff piece in a birdcliff interior. Again, there's carved elements here and there that set the furniture off. This is the interior of the Birdcliff Furniture Shop from 1904. And so we were talking earlier about having all the machinery. There's a planer back there and there's a shaper back there, and everything is powered from a line shaft. They had a gasoline engine sitting out back. So here's this clock in progress. Here's the clock as it is today in an interior that needs restoration, but just a very, very cool piece of furniture in my mind. Here's with the carvings. These are my carvings from the linen press. And so when the carving is done, this gets a real thin coat of shellac. And then I get these colored pencils that are water soluble. And so you kind of color an area in and then take a brush with a little water on it and spread the color around and then coat it with shellac when you're done. And so I got bit pretty hard by that bug and have done a lot of these carvings. Started just carving them for practice, and then it was, well, hey, I could frame that and hang it on the wall. And that's one of the things I do now. And so we're here at the end. This is my first book. My second book and my fourth book got combined a few years ago into one big book. So this is measured drawings of stickly pieces, and there's 61 pieces in there. I'm pretty proud of the fact that, you know, I saw a need for this book and went ahead and did it, and it's still in print and still pretty popular 19 years later. Fine Woodworking said it's one of the 27 books every woodworker should read. And then my latest book, which I published myself, is Drawings for Birdcliff Furniture. And so both of these, there's introductory stuff and it tells the history, tells about how it's made and who made it, that sort of thing. And so that's about all I've got, unless happy to entertain questions. If you guys want to go to my website, and here's the URL for it. This is offers for just you guys. So I have plans in PDF format. I also have books about using SketchUp that are downloadable in PDF format. There's a code you can plug into the cart when you're done, and that'll save you 20%. And then the 2 books I just showed in print, I've got a special deal on those as well. So, any questions?
Hey Bob, this is Colin. Thanks for the presentation. That was fantastic. Hey, I just had a quick question. Would you ever expect to see breadboards on Craftsman style tables?
Hardly ever.
Not common.
No, I mean, that's another thing that became fashionable in the last several years, and people put them everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Personally, I'm convinced they don't really serve the purpose people say they serve. That it's that little skinny piece of wood on the end isn't going to keep that big piece from warping.
Makes sense.
That's just my opinion. They do look nice, you know, and now in green and green furniture, you see them all the time, you know, and they did some cool things with the breadboard end where it's a little bit thicker than the rest of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I've kind of avoided mentioning green and green in this because that's another 2-3 hour discussion of the cool things they did.
Yeah.
And I do have a book about drawings for green and green pieces as well.
Nice. Another quick question, if you don't mind. Do you spray your shellac finish on, or do you put that on by hand?
I generally rag on the first coat and then brush the second coat and then call it a day.
Okay.
So I'm not against spraying, but I don't really have the equipment and the exhaust fan and the desire to fill my basement full of fumes.
Yeah.
Do you
Awesome.
use a 2-pound cut on your shellac?
Theoretically, I get the cans of Zinsser, and I start out thinning it about 50-50, which I think makes a 2-pound cut. But I leave cans of shellac around for a long time. And so as I use them, some of the alcohol evaporates off and I pour a little more alcohol in, or I want it a little more thicker and I throw some more shellac in. I play around with the color a lot, using, you know, sometimes I'll mix amber with the clear, just to get varying degrees of that warm aged look on things. So I'm not at all scientific about my shellacking, but it's pretty thin, and the finish on these pieces is pretty minimal. That it's not a build up filled finish. You know, and I'm basing this on what I see in antiques and museum pieces, that the pores of the white oak are still entirely visible. So, you know, generally it's 1 coat of amber with a rag, 1 or 2 coats of clear with a brush. When I worked on boats, I learned how to brush varnish finishes. So for me, that's like really easy to brush it on. And then a coat of wax and I'm done. And it holds up pretty well. You know, I've got pieces 15, 20 years old that look just fine.
Even on things like tabletops, Bob, as far as protection goes, that's good enough, you think?
That's the current debate at our house, and I would probably, if it were a dining room table, use some sort of polymerized oil. There's one that's, I can't think of the name right at the moment, but it's about twice the price of the Watco Danish oil, but it's got melamine resin in there, and it's pretty durable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think General Finishes make one. So if you're going to be spilling food on it and that kind of thing, I would do an oil like that. Generally, I think shellac fell victim to marketing during the 60s and 70s, that it really wasn't any good. It wasn't very durable. And, you know, unless you're splashing Everclear around your living room, it's pretty durable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have another question if no one else does. Just when you have your through tenons going through your pieces, do you ever wedge those, or is it just straight through? Do you know what I mean?
One of the projects on Pop Wood, I wedged them. There was a bookcase that I made, and I did wedge those, and I angled the wedges at like a dovetail kind of angle. Built the case out of sapele and used Purple Heart for the wedges, and was keenly disappointed because as soon as I oiled it, the colors all ran together, and you can't see the wedges there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes you can patch one with a wedge if you need to, or so I've heard. You know, it generally depends what you want to do and what your goal is. I'm not terribly strict about doing reproductions, although sometimes I am. You know, if it's, I'm the one that has to live with it, so I'm going to please myself, and I don't see
Right.
anything wrong with anybody else changing things. There is a question about the hardware, and do I make my own or do I have a preferred supplier? And I don't make my own. I'd like to learn how, because it's pretty neat. It's taking copper and cutting it to shape, and then banging on it with a hammer to get the little dents in it. There's a guy named Jerry Rucks, GERRYRUCKS, that I bought reproduction hardware from, and he does a great job with it. I went looking for his website the other day, and it looks like he's fallen off the face of the earth. So, and I wish I had a second guy waiting in the wings, because that was where I got it. Some of the things aren't too bad. Rockler for a while was carrying the same hardware that the current Stickley company uses, and it's close but not quite. That it's actually all cast rather than hand hammered, and if you look real close, that's the difference. Now you can find antique pieces of hardware on eBay. Sometimes people are selling it. There may be a few people making it. It's interesting stuff. One thing, oh, while we're talking about hardware, the big strap hinges that's on one of the sideboards, it looks like that's actually part of the hinge, but in the originals, that strap was just a phony piece, a flat piece that they pushed up against a regular butt hinge. And so that would make making your own a lot easier. So let me thank you guys. I've enjoyed this. I'm kind of a hermit that doesn't get to talk much, so I probably won't have to talk to anybody for another year now. So I appreciate the invite. I'm always a little surprised that people ask me to do this kind of thing, and I'm happy to do it.
That was great. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're all welcome. And
Very much appreciated.
yep. Well, you guys know where to find me. And I hope to see you again sometime. You know, we can, I'm available. I also could do a presentation like this on green and green furniture. And then also if there's interest in doing a SketchUp class remotely or something like that, I'm around.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Now I'm going to sign off now.